You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Abraham Lincoln told a story of the discontent with his administration. He said he was reminded about a Long Island fisherman who was accustomed to go eeling every morning. In old days, he assured, he never caught less than a pail full of eels. But since President Lincoln came to power, he hasn't gotten more than half a pail. Therefore, Lincoln told the joke, he would vote for the Democratic Party because he wanted a change.
I am so glad I get to talk about Quince on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. I have a pair of blue jeans from them that look better, hold up nicer, and fit better than many of those jeans with the brand names that you know about, especially because some of those key brand names just aren't getting it done these days the way they used to. Everything at Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Still, even with the great inflation, still Quince is getting it done. Elevate your summer wardrobe. Go to quince.com/myhist for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/MYHIST for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/myhist.
Lincoln provides a good dividing line between those who know history and those who don't. It's fairly common knowledge among people who know a little bit of history that Lincoln's presidency was troubled. Therefore, he had many of these eel fishermen to contend with. But among the general population out there today, those who perhaps don't read much history, the thought is that Lincoln was a great man who sailed through his presidency with no problems, did everything right, and was always popular. Everyone loved Lincoln, right? Like we do now. Lincoln was broadly popular, perhaps for as many as a few months of his entire life. During most of his presidency, he faced criticism from all sides. He ran the country with a coalition of war Democrats and conservative Republicans. 1862 was Lincoln's midterm election, when the entire House of Representatives were up for grabs. We were in the middle of a war, and the man whose image adorned so much of American life, whose name is in everything from towns to toys to tomes. When that man, Lincoln, suffered the same problems as every other president seems to do in a first term, midterm, with the exception of just a few presidents. His coalition came under attack in the congressional elections of that year. And it's interesting to look at this battle, this political battle of 1862. Lincoln took office in 1860 on an unstoppable wave of republicanism in the country. He was a new, dynamic president who everyone in the nation, North and South, knew was going to do more than his predecessor. He was from the West, the new frontier of the country, albeit the relatively established new frontier of Illinois, or say a place like California or Nebraska. Prior to his election, his party, the Republicans, had taken the House for the first time as a party in 1858 and spent 2 years opposing the now lame duck Buchanan. So for 4 years, Republicans had been on a political roll and were getting everything they wanted. Democrats were unpopular generally in the past. The Democratic Party was split between South and North, and the third party took votes from both of these wings of the democracy. With this split going on, Republicans were dominant, especially in the North. In the seesaw of American politics, They were aiming for a fall by 1862. At this time, President Lincoln's political world had four main players. Lincoln's biggest supporters came from the conservative to moderate Republicans. Men like William Seward, or Speaker of the House Galusha Grow of Connecticut, who Lincoln's secretary described as one of the most respectful men towards the president. Another player in the political world of 1862 in the North were the radical Republicans, men like Ben Wade, or Thaddeus Stevens, or Samuel Chase. They wanted Lincoln out. They didn't really want him as president, and they wanted a much more aggressive abolition policy. A third player were the War Democrats. These were men who ran as members of the Democratic Party, but wanted to win the war and beat the Confederates, or at least they wanted to be seen as supporting the war and didn't want to speak out against the war. Samuel Cox of Ohio, George McClellan, these would be examples, even though at this time McClellan was an active commander. These would be examples of war Democrats, men who were members of the Democratic Party who supported the war. The fourth powerful group in the political world of 1862 in the North would be the Peace Democrats. These were men running as Democrats who did not support the war, who actually wanted the war to end, and if they gained power, made it clear they would negotiate with the South to come up with an end that would probably involve the division of the country or some allowance for slavery. Clement Vallandigham would be the best example of a peace Democrat. George Pendleton of Ohio is another. So look at the politics of 1862 this way. Of four major political power groups, Abe Lincoln controlled just one of them. In addition to any lessons for 2010, the midterm election of 1862, Lincoln's first midterm, may also provide an insight into another political question. How do the American people behave during a war? Lincoln's own quote, that the American voters won't swap horses while crossing streams, may have applied to his presidential campaign. Not to spoil the outcome for you here, but it appears when going to midterms during a war, voters don't necessarily have to sing Hail to the Chief. The war had not gone well for the Union Army by the time of the midterm elections in fall 1862. The early forays at Bull Run had not gone well. The Union Army had been smashed at Manassas again in 1862 after being beaten there in 1861. And General McClellan's Peninsular Campaign was essentially turned back. Casualties mounted, as reported daily in the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times. Lists of dead and wounded, as well, could be half the pages in some of these daily papers. Terms of casualties. Bull Run cost 3,300 killed or wounded. Wilson's Creek, another 1,200. Donelson, 2,800. Pea Ridge, 1,300. Shiloh, 13,000. That was a victory, but didn't feel like one. The 7 Days battles, 6,800 Union casualties. Manassas, 15,000 Union casualties. These losses were devastating for public opinion. While we can put Lincoln down a bit off the pedestal of our history class teacher or our old textbooks, who might see him as a Puritan giant who could do no wrong, we still, even in an examination of the very human Abraham Lincoln, the human president and politician, the man Lincoln, we must see him as a great player of the political piano. He had survived a jealous cabinet, a nitpicking Congress. He prosecuted a war and raised hundreds of thousands of soldiers all over the country, while struggling to keep moderates involved. But Lincoln wasn't perfect. He was not able, no matter what kind of charm or political skill he had, to keep Virginia in the Union. But he did manage to keep Kentucky and East Tennessee, and, with a mix of charm and disarm, Maryland in the Union. Yet the battlefield turns were hard for anyone to handle. Not only did it make further troop recruitment difficult, but it added a new foreign policy dilemma to Lincoln's baggage. With a sympathetic prime minister, Britain looked closer and closer to cutting a deal with the South, recognizing them. We tend to think of a president and his party in Congress, right? Obama and the Democrats in Congress, or Lincoln and the Republicans in Congress, etc. In much the way we might see, to use a football example, a quarterback and the offensive line all working together. Certainly, it works this way sometimes. Certainly, most presidents want their party to clean up in midterm elections. No doubt. They want their party to win rather than their party to lose. And most speakers of the House, most Congresses want their president to succeed as well. But there are conflicts of interest. And so it was with Lincoln and the Republicans. Powerful differences in what each had to get done. It might have done well in 1862 for Lincoln to stay quiet, hope for a Union victory, and hope for his party to do well in the elections. Maybe he could take the train to Illinois, to Ohio, to Indiana, where members of the Republican Party were facing some tough races. Not done at that time. Incumbent presidents didn't campaign like that. He was obviously busy with the war. But Lincoln did not remain quiet. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862 brought over 12,000 Union casualties. It was not a win, though technically it could be considered so, because McClellan's army had pushed the Confederates out of their foray into Union territory, into Maryland. But McClellan, much to Lincoln's chagrin, did not pursue and beat the Confederate army. He merely was content with allowing the Confederate army to cross the Potomac and leave Union territory. The Northern press noticed the bloodiest single day in American history was at best a stalemate, not the best for a crafty politician to launch a new policy. Yet it was enough that Britain might join the Confederacy as an ally and recognize them was heavy on Lincoln's mind. Such a loss of a major European power would have great effects on the war and on politics. It was this thought, among many thoughts, among a general feeling on Lincoln's part that the war had to change, the focus of the war had to change, that led Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It freed slaves in all areas outside of Union control where rebellion was going on. This exempted the slave owners in Kentucky and Maryland. Officially announced in September of 1862, this was occurring right as members of Congress, Republican and Democrat, were vying for seats across the country, or across the North at least. It was shocking because Lincoln had been a moderate, meaning that he hadn't in the past expressed a desire to free any slaves, only to prevent slavery from extending beyond the South into new territories. But it wasn't entirely without precedent, and this is something that's not as well known, that at the time President Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation order, there had been actions of Congress being controlled by much more radical Republicans, of a very similar nature. The Republican Congress had already in 1862 put a ban on slavery in Washington, D.C., and they had banned enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, which would have required people in the North to return slaves that had run away from the South. They, in effect, repealed that law. They also introduced in June of 1862 an act that free slaves owned by slaveholders who had, quote, supported the rebellion. This is very similar already to the Emancipation Proclamation, but because of the vagueness of the term supported the rebellion, it was unclear that it could ever be enforced. How can you prove someone supported the rebellion or not? Lincoln's order was more direct and more broad. In modern-day political terms, we might say that Lincoln hit the reset button, that Lincoln reframed the issue that Lincoln came up with a new message. He changed the focus of the war. It was no longer just a war to preserve the Union. It was now very much a war to end slavery. And there was no way under those circumstances, morally, that British public opinion would tolerate their prime minister getting involved with the Confederacy. Lincoln's cabinet was against his move, and the papers, even some friendly papers, worried about the situation it might create in the army. Not everyone fighting in the Union effort wanted to free slaves. Democrats condemned it. Even John Sherman, a moderate Republican and an ally of Lincoln, found the proclamation to be ill-timed, coming as it did during the midterms. For the average Republican, or better said, the average Republican running in a marginal seat, Lincoln's proclamation was unhelpful, unwelcome news. It would be like as if President Obama suddenly announced a doubling of the deficit or a second healthcare overhaul in September of this year. I'm not sure Democrats running would like it very much. There is a particular difference between 1862 and 2010. That must be stated. There was no one day, no single election day for everyone to vote for their member of the House of Representatives, as you will see in 2010. Elections were scheduled by the states and occurred in different times with wide variance. But most of them were in September and October of 1862, the fall of 1862. And this was a time when the situation for the Union and for Lincoln's administration was just about the same. There wasn't much difference between September or October of that year. But some other elections in what we might put in quotes as the midterm of 62 were actually held in 1863, some as late as the spring of 1863. About 80% of the elections, however, were held in the fall. This is important because it helps to provide a picture, the variance between the timing of these two elections, but we'll discuss this later. Emancipation, suspension of civil rights, a partisan press, and battlefield results took a toll. Republicans lost in the 1862 midterms 23 House seats, and were particularly hit hard in Lincoln's home state of Illinois, the neighboring Indiana, and Ohio. Among the casualties, the Speaker of the House, Galucia Grow of Connecticut, too much of a radical Republican, too much of a Lincoln supporter, was defeated. Lincoln's home congressman, Leonard Swett, was defeated by Democrat John T. Stewart. The most ironic part of that is Stewart had been, in the past, a law partner of Lincoln, and actually was good friends with Mary Todd Lincoln, and would visit the White House often. But politically, Stewart was opposed and ran opposed to the Emancipation Proclamation. The loss of 23 Republican House members was devastating for Lincoln's party. Only because of Union Democrats, these were Democrats in Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, people who ran on the Democratic Party but supported the Union and supported the war effort and the Emancipation Proclamation, would Lincoln be able to control events in the House and put in Schuyler Colfax, a Republican, as the Speaker. But as a party, they lost 5% of their 1860 congressional vote. They lost the 23 seats. And they controlled a minority. Just 47% of the House of Representatives was made up of declared Republicans. It became, in effect, a coalition government after that. It was so much of a coalition government that it would see the name of the Republican Party change in the 1864 presidential election to the Union Party. Another consequence of the 1862 election, one that probably has the most meaning for American politics, is because of the results of 1862, not only would the Republicans change their name for that one election to the Union Party, but Lincoln would tap Andrew Johnson, his loyal supporter, a Union Democrat from East Tennessee, as the vice presidential nominee. That had lots of consequences when Lincoln ended up being assassinated in 1865. Yet, although they may have changed American history and the presidency, the midterm elections didn't directly change the war policy. Everyone had a different opinion as to why Lincoln and his party lost the midterms of 1862 and the Democrats did fairly well. Democrats, of course, saw it as the result of the president's war policy, the conscription policy, and the suspension of habeas corpus and some press in various parts of the country who were critical of the war. For John Sherman, moderate Republican, slow movements on the Potomac and then especially in Kentucky discouraged people, he said. Sherman found it singular, meaning peculiar, that Democrats who opposed the war, who didn't want the war anyway, would benefit from the public perception that the war wasn't being prosecuted strongly enough. But these are how events go, Sherman said. What is interesting about 1862 is it has been extensively studied by a group of professors at the University of Michigan. Professors Jamie Carson and Jeffrey Jenkins looked at the election data from these midterms and looked at some of the reasons behind Lincoln's party's loss. As is the case today, they found that the action was around marginal districts and that the administration's troubles had little impact on the very solid Republican districts. These were defined as districts that had been Republican for more than 2 terms. They were 8 times as likely for the Republican incumbent to win. Interestingly enough, casualties in a district, how many dead or wounded were in that district, did not affect the win or loss of a Republican Party incumbent. It was not statistically significant at all. The average district suffered 8,500 casualties, but some suffered 4 times that many, and it didn't matter. It was not statistically significant how many casualties had been suffered in a district. To some extent, that makes for an interesting study of elections during wartime. We do know that American voters have no problem punishing a party during a war, even right after a victory. We know that from the results of 1918 during World War I, 1944 during World War II, and 1898 during the Spanish-American War, right after the Spanish-American War, where nonetheless, even though we were in war or right after a victory, the incumbent party suffered losses. From this study of 1862, we have at least one model that shows that the actual number of casualties or the direct amount of sacrifice in the war from that district didn't affect the president's party. However, it seems clear that what did affect the party is not so much direct casualties from a district, direct sacrifice in the war from a district, but the general perception of how the war was going. And in 1862, there was a string of northern defeats or very costly victories, Shiloh and Antietam among them. Because of the split in the timing of the elections, it makes it fairly clear of the impact of national events on these races, and not just events in the district. This is because 1/4 of the elections of 1862, put that in quotes, midterm, were actually held in 1863, when the war was going a bit better. Republicans, the professors found, were more likely to win the 1863 elections than the 1862 elections. The Michigan State study found that if all the midterms were held in 1862, Lincoln and the Republicans actually would have faced an additional loss of 7 seats. Might have made it more difficult to form a coalition government. If the elections were held in 1863, however, Lincoln and the Republicans wouldn't have suffered in a midterm, but actually would have picked up 20 seats. 1863 elections brought much better results for the Republicans than those held in the September and October canvasses of fall 1862, when things were going so rotten for the Union. So emancipation, battle losses, and harsh methods seem to trump the actual sacrifice within a district. An interesting stat, and one to look at with other elections. Although we think the idea of national elections where voters might vote against Congressman Joe Smith in a district in order to punish President Obama, though we think of that as maybe a modern thing, it appears it existed back then the same. The midterms in 1862 were a referendum on the presidency, and a referendum not necessarily on the sacrifice just in one district, but on how the administration's policy was going on a national level. With a trusted procrastinator, Larry Sabato, predicting a loss big enough to give Republicans control of the House, with 538, the political website, predicting perhaps a loss of 50 or more House seats by the Democrats, it seems that President Obama is facing some similar trouble. I don't do midterm predictions, but I do think we'll see losses commensurate with the historical trends. It's a first term of a president, and they're going to face losses. The Senate may be saved, or Democrats may save the Senate for themselves, or may end up with a 50-50 with Joe Biden breaking ties. But one thing's clear. In 2010, as 1862, these losses are not necessarily reflective of the personality of one House member or another, but are directly tied to the performance of the administration and the economy. In this case, the economy, the war in Afghanistan, and health care are probably going to be the three issues that dominate. In each of these, there's an interesting dual problem. Healthcare, for instance, will face some criticism from those who wanted to go farther. Maybe they wanted a universal health system, and will face criticism from those who wanted no reform at all, or want to repeal that reform. In Afghanistan, those who think we should be prosecuting the war will be mixed in their opposition to the present administration's party with those who want out. On the economy, those who want the government to do more will have the impact the same as those who want to see government completely out of the economy. Some may vote in the voting booth, others may vote by not voting in a midterm at all, as so many voters do. 1862 is an example of another of so many where the president's party lost seats, nearly to their political detriment and to the paralysis of their presidencies. But it's perhaps an interesting perspective when we think that that president was one of the most respected people in American history, someone who we give enormous credit for their political skill to, and yet he was not able to avoid a midterm loss. Like Lincoln's old Long Island fishermen, voters will probably see their pail half empty and want change. I want to thank you for listening. The website is myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. And if you like the program, as I always say, please tell someone about it. Thanks for listening.